This is a fictional story inspired by real life. The first thing that Arthur Vance observed when he returned to his family estate after 3 long months of driving cattle across the dusty trails to the bustling markets of Yorkshire was a small flock of goats grazing peacefully in his eastern meadow. They moved with an air of complete tranquility, as if every blade of lush green grass beneath their hooves belonged to them by divine right. Arthur reined in his horse, a powerful, dark roan gelding named Hector, on the crest of the hill and stood quietly, looking down at the small valley below. The sun of a late September afternoon in the year 1874 was lengthening, casting a warm, golden glow over the rolling English countryside, and with that soft amber light, the entire scene looked remarkably beautiful. It would have been a perfect picture of rural peace if one could simply ignore the fact that those goats had absolutely no legal right to be there. There were about 14 of them in total, Arthur counted, most of them dotted with white patches, though there was one exceptionally dark, pitch-black goat that appeared to be the boldest and most adventurous of the group. They had wandered right down to the edge of his stream, the clear watercourse that flowed through the lower meadow, and were drinking deeply from the wooden trough that Arthur had spent 2 entire summers digging out by hand. They drank without a single care in the world, entirely unaware of the rider watching them from the ridge. Arthur remained there for a long time, slowly turning his worn hat between his calloused hands, feeling the fine dust of 1,000 miles of travel still settled deep in the creases of his neck. He was 31 years of age, and he had owned this land in his own right since he was 26, when his father passed away and left him the property deed along with a mountain of heavy debts that had taken Arthur 4 difficult years of constant cattle driving to fully pay off. The estate was his, the stream was his, and the fresh grass those goats were chewing down to the very soil was very much his own. He firmly pulled his hat back down over his brow and guided Hector down the steep slope of the hill. The goats scattered slightly as the large horse approached, all except the black one, which planted its hooves firmly in the middle of the path and stared up at him with narrow, rectangular yellow pupils full of all the quiet disdain in the world. Arthur simply guided Hector around the stubborn animal and continued forward. Past the stream, tucked safely into the deep shadow of a cluster of ancient willow trees that marked the eastern boundary of his property, he saw something he did not expect to find at all. It was a real, functioning campsite, not the temporary resting place of a wandering vagabond. There was a sturdy canvas tent stretched neatly between 2 large trees, well anchored to the ground with high-quality ropes and strong wooden stakes. A small cooking fire had been built within a neat circle of heavy stones, its embers still glowing warm with life, though the open flames had already died down. A simple wooden crate served as a rustic table, and upon it sat a polished lantern, a clean tin cup, and a small glass jar filled with what appeared to be dried medicinal herbs. Leaning against the trunk of the largest willow tree, right next to the tent, was a double-barreled shotgun, and sitting with her legs crossed on a thick woolen horse blanket, spread out upon the grass, stitching a leather bridle strap with remarkably deft, steady hands, and humming a low, gentle melody to herself, was a woman. She had not heard him arrive over the soft rustle of the leaves. The autumn wind was blowing in the opposite direction, carrying the sound of Hector's heavy hooves away into the vast, empty fields behind them. She continued her quiet humming, her dark hair gathered without much order at the nape of her neck, with several loose strands brushing softly against her cheek with each passing breeze. She wore a simple, practical dress of blue-patterned cotton that had clearly seen many days of hard labor, and a pair of sturdy leather boots that had obviously seen even more. Her hands moved with absolute confidence over the tough leather strap, the heavy needle passing cleanly through the material with practiced ease. Arthur brought Hector to a halt about 20 feet away and cleared his throat loudly to announce his presence. The woman rose to her feet in a single, fluid movement. The leather strap fell to the blanket, and the shotgun was already held firmly in her hands before he could even blink. She was aiming it directly at the center of his chest, with the calm, steady resolve of someone who had faced danger before and felt no hesitation whatsoever about doing it again. Arthur slowly lifted both of his hands into the air, keeping them completely visible in the fading light. "That land you are currently camping on happens to be mine," Arthur said, his voice calm but firm. She did not lower the weapon. Her eyes were dark, a deep, rich shade of brown that seemed almost black in the shadow of the willows, and she was studying him carefully, like someone reading a complex legal contract that they did not entirely. She was young, perhaps 24 or 25 years of age, with high, prominent cheekbones, and a mouth held tight in a line of careful concentration. "I know," she replied simply, her voice clear and direct, containing no hint of apology. Arthur blinked in surprise at her bluntness. "You know?" he asked. "I know," she repeated, letting a quiet moment pass between them. "And I suppose those are your goats drinking from my private stream?" Arthur asked, gesturing toward the water. "They are 14 alpine goats, and one Nubian," she explained calmly. "The black one is named Trouble, just in case that explains her behavior." Arthur stared at her intently, trying to fathom the situation. "Madam, you are currently trespassing on private property with 14 goats and a black goat named Trouble, and you are currently pointing an unloaded shotgun directly at my chest." A subtle change appeared in her expression, not quite a smile, but the distinct beginning of one that she was working hard to suppress. She slowly lowered the barrels until they pointed toward the ground, though she did not set the weapon aside completely. "I know that as well. I was fully intending to walk up to the main manor house to speak with whoever owned this land, but I only arrived late yesterday evening, and I needed to settle the goats before darkness fell. This morning, I thought it best to wait until a reasonable hour, and then I became completely absorbed in my leatherwork." She paused for a brief second. "I was fully intending to come looking for you." "Well, it seems I found you first," Arthur remarked, easing his posture slightly. "So it appears," she agreed, her tone shifting to one of practical evaluation. Arthur guided Hector one step closer, studying the small campsite with a fresh perspective. Everything was perfectly orderly, arranged with clear purpose and care. She had cleverly used the natural windbreak provided by the ancient willow trees, positioning the entrance of the canvas tent away from the east, where the rough autumn weather usually came from. She had even dug a neat shallow trench entirely around the stone fireplace to ensure proper drainage in case of heavy rain. It was obvious she knew exactly what she was doing in the wilderness. "Who are you?" Arthur asked, looking down from his saddle. "My name is Margaret Mercer," she said, offering no handshake since he remained mounted, and the shotgun still rested between them, but she looked him directly in the eyes without flinching. "I used to own land about 8 miles north of here," she said, tilting her head slightly toward the distant hills. "My father's farm." Arthur thought about her words for a moment, remembering a small, modest property to the north that had been sitting abandoned for the past 2 years. He had never known the family well. "You used to own it?" he asked gently, noticing the past tense. A shadow of profound sorrow crossed her face. Quick and tightly controlled, the kind of deep emotional wound that has been handled so many times it is spoken of as a simple matter of fact. "My father passed away last spring after a long battle with his health," she said, her voice remaining steady. "The farm carried heavy debts, and the county bank reclaimed the property in July." She held her chin high, refusing to show weakness. "The goats were already mine, completely free of any debt. I had a small amount of savings, so I packed up everything I could carry on a single wagon and went searching for a place to go." Arthur looked at the neat campsite once again, then turned his gaze back to the goats that had wandered back to the stream, resuming their drinking with total unconcern. He looked at Margaret, who was watching him with an expression that was neither proud nor defeated, but simply remarkably honest. "Are you planning to make cheese?" Arthur asked. It was not a random guess. He had heard from experienced farmers that alpine goats produced excellent, rich milk. "And soap," Margaret added, her eyes blinking slightly in surprise at his accurate assessment. "The milk from alpine goats makes a wonderful, gentle soap. I can sell both products in the nearby market town." She paused, taking a quiet breath. "I have a clear plan, Mr. Vance. I did not come here to cause you any difficulties. I am only here because I simply ran out of other places to go, and this particular lower meadow was completely empty, and your stream runs incredibly clean." Arthur Vance was not a man who made important decisions quickly. He had learned the value of caution the hard way, just as most men living in the rural counties did, through difficult experiences and the particular education that comes from watching things go terribly wrong. His father had been a man who said yes far too quickly and said no much too late, and the overwhelming financial burdens that had shortened his life were proof of that flaw. Arthur had rebuilt this entire estate through careful, deliberate choices. He sat upon Hector for a long, long time, silently observing this solitary woman, her 14 goats, her orderly camp, and her remarkably honest eyes. "You may stay here until the winter passes," Arthur said at last, his voice firm. But it must be under certain conditions. Margaret straightened her shoulders slightly, her dark eyes narrowing with practical interest. And what might those conditions be, Mr. Vance? She inquired. Keep those goats completely out of my northern pasture, Arthur stated clearly. My breeding cattle will be spending the winter months up there, and I absolutely do not need that kind of unnecessary complications. Furthermore, you must keep your cooking fire strictly controlled at all times, because this autumn has been exceptionally dry, and the surrounding grass burns remarkably fast. And finally, you will come up to the main house tomorrow, so we can properly arrange the formal terms for your use of this water and pasture land, like two people with a bit of practical sense. Margaret Mercer studied his face for 3 full seconds, weighing his words carefully. That is entirely reasonable, she said plainly. You can lower your hands now, Mr. Vance. She leaned the unloaded shotgun back against the willow tree. It wasn't even loaded, she remarked with a small, subtle glimmer of amusement in her eyes. Arthur looked at her, then looked at the weapon, deciding that he believed her statement. He also decided it was best not to voice his immediate thought that she had successfully managed to scare him away from her camp with an empty gun, and he would never have known the difference. It was a quality of mind that was far more interesting than he was willing to admit to himself at that exact moment. I will come by the main house tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, Margaret said, confirming the arrangement. Arthur touched the brim of his hat in a polite gesture. I will have the coffee ready, he replied. He turned Hector around and rode up toward the main manor house, forcing himself not to look back, though he thought about her the entire way up the hill. He was still thinking about her when he led Hector into the warmth of the stable and began the familiar routine of removing the heavy leather saddle. He was still thinking about her when he sat alone at his wooden kitchen table with a plate of cold leftover beans and an oil lamp that desperately needed its wick trimmed. And the thought of her did not stop when he finally lay down in his quiet bed. It was her eyes, he decided, and the calm, matter-of-fact way she had said she had simply run out of other places to go, speaking with the same lack of drama as if she were merely reporting the daily weather. That specific kind of honesty was incredibly rare in the world. It was also the kind of honesty that could get a person into serious trouble if the world decided to be unkind, and the world in those days had no particular commitment to being kind to anyone, let alone a solitary woman living in a canvas tent with a flock of goats on someone else's land. Arthur stared up at the dark wooden ceiling of his bedroom until sleep finally overtook him, and his very last conscious thought was a sincere hope that she had extinguished her cooking fire properly before lying down to rest. By the following morning, he knew she had kept her word. There was no smoke rising from the direction of the willow grove, which meant she had allowed the fire to die out naturally and covered the hot embers with earth, just like someone who truly understood the ways of the land. Margaret arrived at his front porch at 7 o'clock in the morning. Exactly. A punctuality that told Arthur a great deal about her respect for time and her commitment to doing exactly what she promised. She had changed into a different dress, identical in its simple, hard-working style, but of a deep forest green, and her dark hair was gathered much more firmly at the back of her head. She carried a small leather-bound notebook and a freshly sharpened pencil. Arthur had the hot coffee ready, just as he had promised. They sat down on opposite sides of the sturdy wooden kitchen table with the steaming cups between them and the notebook laid open, and together they began to write out a simple, clear agreement in plain language, which they both recorded in their own writing. Margaret had brought her own materials because she clearly had no intention of relying on anyone else's record of what had been decided between them. According to their agreement, she would have the exclusive use of the eastern meadow and the lower section of the stream starting from the southern fork. She would keep her goats entirely out of the northern pasture and completely away from his cattle at all times. In exchange for the use of the grass and water, she would contribute 1 full day of hard labor per week to the estate, performing whatever tasks Arthur needed done that she could reasonably accomplish. She would have the right to camp within the willow grove throughout the cold winter months, and until the arrival of spring, at which point they would completely renegotiate the terms based on how the situation had developed. 1 full day of labor every week is quite a lot, Margaret noted, her tone not one of complaint, but of pure practical calculation, because her own daily operations were going to consume a vast amount of her time and energy. Let us say half a day instead, Arthur offered gently. Every Saturday morning. That works perfectly, she replied, nodding her approval. What kind of work do you know how to do? Arthur inquired. She gave him a steady, unblinking look over the rim of her coffee cup. I know how to cook, sew, ride a horse, shoot accurately, mend broken fences. help a cow through a difficult birth, vaccinate livestock against disease if you have the proper medicine, read a property deed clearly, and make a soap that can strip the rust right off an iron fence post. Arthur had certainly not expected an answer like that. Perhaps he had subconsciously expected her to say she knew how to cook and sew and leave the list at that, but as he listened to her speak, he felt a strange sensation stirring deep within his chest, a feeling he quickly classified as profound respect, because respect was a safe and comfortable emotion to feel. I have a long stretch of broken fence along the southern boundary that has been waiting for repair since last spring, Arthur said, breaking the brief silence. Would it be acceptable if I helped you with that this coming Saturday morning? That would be fine, she agreed. She closed her leather notebook with a sharp snap, tucked her pencil away, and stood up from the table. Arthur noticed now that they were both standing that she was nearly as tall as he was. Thank you, Mr. Vance. I assure you that I will give you absolutely no reason to regret this arrangement. Arthur, he corrected her gently. If we are going to be living as neighbors, you should call me Arthur. A brief, warm light passed through her serious expression, which she quickly managed back into a look of simple politeness. Arthur, then, she said. She walked down the wooden steps of the porch and headed back toward the eastern meadow. He stood in the doorway with his coffee cup in his hand, watching her figure grow smaller in the distance, and the sudden thought crossed his mind that his large house had never felt quite so empty as it did the exact moment she disappeared from his sight. He had a great deal of work to do that day, so he pushed the thought aside and went about his chores. The following weeks fell into a regular, peaceful rhythm that Arthur had not entirely foreseen. He had lived completely alone on the estate for 2 full years, accompanied only by his old farmhand, Silas, who was 63 years of age and had worked with livestock since long before Arthur was even born. Silas lived in a small stone cottage near the lower barns, cooked his own simple meals, and held incredibly strong opinions about almost everything, though he generally chose to keep most of them to himself. The sudden arrival of Margaret and her flock of goats had altered the particular silence of the property, but not in the disruptive way Arthur had initially feared. She was never a nuisance in any sense of the word. Her daily routine in the willow grove was incredibly methodical. Every morning, from the high ridge where the main house stood, Arthur could clearly see the small, orderly movement of goats crossing the eastern meadow in the long, pale shadows of the early dawn, and if he happened to wake up right at sunrise, he could sometimes hear her voice carrying across the quiet morning air, speaking to them in low, clear tones. The exact words were never audible, but the gentle, reassuring tone always reached him. She knew every single goat by its individual name. She had admitted this to him on that very first morning, speaking a bit defensively, as if she fully expected him to find it foolish, but he had not found it foolish at all. On their first Saturday morning together, she arrived at the southern boundary fence with her thick leather work gloves already on, evaluating the damage with a highly critical eye. She walked the entire line, noting exactly where the wooden posts needed to be leveled, where the wire needed new metal staples, and where an entire section had been completely knocked down by the cattle and would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. This particular post has severe rot at the very base of its root, Margaret said, placing her gloved hand firmly around the timber and rocking it back and forth. It moves far more than it should. We need to dig it out completely and replace it with a fresh one. Do you happen to have any sturdy cedar posts up in the main barn? I do, Arthur replied, impressed by her thoroughness. Cedar lasts much longer in this wet soil. Who put these old ones in? My father put these in, Arthur explained softly, looking at the decaying wood. He used pine because it was much cheaper at the time. Margaret looked at him, and the stern expression in her dark eyes softened by a visible degree. Pine was indeed cheaper, she said gently. It makes complete sense why he chose it under the circumstances. They worked steadily side by side for 4 full hours, completely rebuilding the southern boundary line, a task that would have easily taken Arthur 3 entire days of backbreaking labor if he had been working entirely alone. Margaret never complained once, nor did she ever slow her pace. At one point, when the heavy post-hole digger struck a hidden stone deep in the earth and the wooden handle kicked back with tremendous force, hitting her arm, she let out a sharp, unexpected word that surprised Arthur so much he burst into genuine laughter. Margaret stood there looking thoroughly mortified for a second, but then she too broke into a wide, wonderful laugh. It was the very first time he had ever heard her laugh, and it was a beautiful, sincere sound that did something strange to the inside of his chest, something he could not quite put a name to right away. They ate their midday meal sitting on the back of his wooden utility wagon, sharing cold biscuits and dried beef that he had packed that morning, and they talked. It was their very first real conversation that went completely beyond the practical logistics of their formal agreement. Margaret told him all about how she had grown up on her father's modest farm, describing the incredibly difficult years that followed her mother's passing when Margaret was only 12 years of age, leaving her to practically run the entire household while her father labored in the fields from dawn until dusk. She related the story without a single hint of drama, seeking absolutely no pity or compassion, but simply stating the facts of her life as they were. In turn, Arthur told her about his long cattle drives, the mud and chaos of the northern rail markets, and the peculiar, intense loneliness of driving a massive herd across the open plains, looking up at a sky so incredibly vast that it could make a man feel either entirely insignificant or completely free, depending on the day. "And which of the two did you feel most often?" she asked, tilting her head to look up at the expansive blue sky above them. Arthur thought about her question with absolute honesty for a moment. "I felt both at the exact same time," he confessed. Margaret nodded slowly, as if that answer made perfect sense to her, and Arthur felt that subtle, internal shift once again, the feeling he kept trying to classify as simple neighborly respect, though he was completely failing to do so. October arrived with a sharp, crisp chill that cut through the morning air and turned the leaves of the willow trees from a vibrant green to a brilliant, burning yellow, illuminating the grove where Margaret was camped like a bright lantern against the brown grass. The very first authentic cold wave of the season arrived in the middle of the month, and Arthur woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning with a distinct, unsettling feeling about the temperature, the kind of deep rancher's instinct that operates long before full consciousness returns. He quickly built up the fire in his own kitchen stove, and then, without making a deliberate decision to do so, found himself putting on his heavy woolen coat and walking down toward the eastern meadow. Margaret was already awake and moving. She had built up her campfire, and she was walking among her goats with a lighted lantern, counting them carefully to ensure that every single one was accounted for and safe. She had managed to build a rustic, temporary shelter using a large canvas tarp and 2 fork-shaped willow branches, and she was gently herding the goats toward it with the competent ease of someone who had faced winter storms before. "They are going to be perfectly fine," she said clearly when she heard his heavy footsteps approaching through the frost. "Alpine goats handle the cold reasonably well, but Molasses, the youngest of the flock, is quite thin, and I want to ensure she is fully covered tonight." Arthur looked at the fragile canvas shelter. It would certainly serve its purpose for a night or two of light frost, but if a true English winter descended upon the valley, it was not going to be nearly enough to protect the animals. He thought of his own large stone barn, which had a wonderful, solid section in the very back that was completely empty at the moment. "I have a large, secure pen at the back of the main barn," Arthur said. "It is completely clean, perfectly dry, and has more than enough space for all of them. You can bring them up here whenever the weather becomes truly serious." Margaret turned around to look at him, the warm light of her lantern reflecting in her dark eyes as she tried to read his intentions. "Would you truly allow a flock of goats into your main barn, Arthur?" "They certainly wouldn't be the very first goats to step foot in that barn," he replied with a slight smile, "and they certainly won't be the last." She remained quiet for a moment, the lantern light catching the faint glimmer of moisture in her dark eyes. "You are remarkably kind, Arthur Vance," she said in a soft, quiet voice, as if the realization genuinely surprised her. Arthur didn't quite know how to respond to such direct praise, so he simply cleared his throat. "The pen is located in the back left corner," he said. "There is plenty of fresh straw already laid down. And what about you? Do you truly intend to remain sleeping out here in this canvas tent when the real winter freezing arrives?" "I have a perfectly good spare room up at the house," he added, the words escaping his mouth before he had even fully processed them. He felt the ground move slightly beneath his feet as he realized what he had just offered. "It has a real wooden door and a proper bed. It was my sister's room before she married and moved away to the city. It sits entirely empty." Margaret Mercer looked at him with those deep, honest eyes for a long time. The lantern flickered slightly as a sudden gust of cold wind swept through the willow trees. One of the goats, the bold black Nubian named Trouble, walked over and rested its solid head firmly against Margaret's knee, and her hand automatically went down to stroke its neck. I absolutely do not wish to impose upon your hospitality any more than I already have, she said carefully, her voice filled with caution. You wouldn't be imposing at all, Arthur insisted. The room has a sturdy door and everything, and I simply do not like the thought of anyone sleeping outside in this freezing temperature when there is a perfectly warm house sitting less than 30 yards away. It is just simple practical sense. Margaret let out a soft, tiny breath that could have been a suppressed laugh or a quiet sigh of relief. Simple practical sense, she repeated softly. Very well, Arthur. I will accept your offer for a few days until this cold front passes, but I insist on paying my own way, whether it is through extra labor or by providing you with some of that goat's milk soap you seem to think is so miraculous. It's a deal, Arthur said, a feeling of genuine warmth spreading through him. And so, that very night, Margaret slept safely in his sister's old bedroom, and Arthur slept in his own, and between them was a wide hallway and a firmly closed wooden door. Yet, the entire house felt completely different, far more alive, less lonely, and no longer drifting aimlessly in the vast quiet of the open countryside. The following morning, when she came down to the kitchen before dawn and set the coffee to boil without him even having to ask, he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her move effortlessly between the stove and the pantry, as if she had been doing it her entire life. What is it? She asked, noticing his silent gaze. Nothing, Arthur replied, though it was not nothing at all. It was everything. It was the first winter in many years that he was not going to have to spend completely alone, and for the first time in his life, he found himself not caring at all about how cold the coming months might be. By November, Margaret's small goat operation actually began to turn a modest profit. She had taken the business of making cheese incredibly seriously. She had traveled all the way to the larger market town of Clearwater and returned with the specialized equipment she needed, paying for it entirely out of her hard-earned savings with the careful, exact spending of someone who knew precisely how much money they possessed and exactly what every single coin needed to accomplish. She set up her equipment in a quiet corner of the stone barn and began to produce small, beautiful rounds of soft cheese, which she carefully wrapped in clean cloth and carried to town every Tuesday. Clearwater was the nearest town of any real size, located about 14 miles to the east, and she drove her own wooden wagon there and back, returning with cold cash in her pocket and a growing list of orders for the following week. She made her soap using goat tallow and wood ash lye, strictly following her mother's old recipe, which she had completely memorized years ago and could produce from memory without ever consulting a single written record. She sold the soap in Clearwater as well, securing a permanent ordering agreement with a general store owner named Harold Birch, who had been searching for a reliable local supplier of high-quality soap. Arthur could see her business taking solid shape, much like watching a sturdy building being constructed day by day. The skeleton of her plan was becoming solid, real, and completely self-sufficient. He felt a tremendous growing admiration for her, which he expressed in the only way he knew how, by ensuring that everything on his side of the estate ran perfectly smoothly, so her daily work would never be hindered. He thoroughly repaired the fences around the eastern meadow, brought in extra hay for her goats, and kept a constant watch over the property. One evening, during a Thursday night dinner, with the kitchen stove throwing out a wonderful heat and a sharp November wind rattling the glass panes of the windows, he mentioned to her that he had tracked and safely relocated a wild predator that had been lingering near her flock. Margaret immediately set her fork down on the table and looked at him with intense seriousness. You absolutely should have told me the moment you saw it, Arthur, she said firmly. Those are my goats, and that is my responsibility. I am not a person who needs someone else to manage my affairs without my knowledge. I am here because I want to be entirely self-sufficient, not because I want someone else making decisions for me. Arthur considered her words carefully, recognizing the absolute truth in them. It had been pure instinct that drove him, the exact same protective instinct that had made him walk down to her camp on that freezing morning. But he understood now that there was a vital difference between protecting someone, excluding them from their own life. You are entirely right, Margaret, he admitted honestly. I should have told you. She looked at him for a second, the tension leaving her shoulders, and a warm smile appeared on her face. Thank you for taking care of it, though, she added softly. That was the wonderful thing about Margaret Mercer that he was continually discovering. She was never unreasonable or bitter about the hardships she had faced. She was specific, she knew exactly what she needed, she spoke with absolute clarity, and when an issue was resolved, she moved forward without holding a single grudge. He found himself thinking more and more about the coming spring, wondering if she would choose to stay when the lease ended, and what he wanted that future to look like, though he was not yet ready to say those thoughts out loud. December arrived with a severe, punishing northern frost that completely froze the edges of the stream. Margaret officially moved her goats into the warm barn permanent, and Arthur helped her every morning without her ever having to ask, arriving at the barn at the exact same time she did. They moved around the space with the perfect ease of two people who had thoroughly learned each other's daily rhythms. On one of the coldest mornings of the month, when the temperature had dropped far below freezing overnight and the water buckets had a thick layer of ice that had to be broken with a heavy iron rod, Margaret suddenly slipped on a patch of black ice just inside the barn door. Arthur lunged forward and caught her firmly by the arms before she could strike the hard ground. He held her close for a long second, her hands resting against his forearms, and they were close enough that he could clearly see the tiny white cloud of her breath in the freezing air and the bright color the cold had brought to her cheeks. They remained frozen in that position for a moment that felt far too long to be just an accident of balance. Then, Margaret gently broke the silence. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice slightly softer than usual. She took a step back and immediately went to break the ice in the water buckets as if absolutely nothing had happened. Arthur went about his own chores, saying nothing at all, but he thought about that brief moment for the rest of the day and through most of the quiet night. He was deeply in love with Margaret Mercer. He wasn't entirely sure when it had actually happened, but he was honest enough with himself to admit that the feeling was real and that it was never going to disappear. Christmas of 1874 was a quiet, peaceful affair on the estate. On Christmas Day, Margaret surprised him by baking a beautiful, rich spice cake using her mother's old recipe, and she prepared a wonderful roast from the beef he had stored away in the autumn. They invited old Silas up to the main house for dinner, and the old man sat at the table with his hat held politely in his hands, eating with the careful, quiet manners of someone who understood he was being treated with genuine respect. After dinner, Silas returned to his cottage, leaving Arthur and Margaret sitting quietly by the warm stove. "I have something for you," Arthur said, feeling a wave of nervous awkwardness wash over him. He walked over to the wooden sideboard and brought back a small package, neatly wrapped in brown paper, placing it gently on the table in front of her. "I saw it in town last week, and I immediately thought of you." Margaret opened it with exquisite care, folding the paper neatly without tearing a single edge, just like someone who grew up knowing that materials must never be wasted. Inside lay a beautiful, small daily journal bound in rich, dark leather with a sturdy brass clasp, along with a handful of high-quality graphite pencils. "For your business accounts," Arthur explained softly, "your operation is becoming far too successful to keep relying on loose notebooks." Margaret held the leather journal in both hands, her eyes glistening with a sudden warmth that she worked hard to control. "Thank you, Arthur," she whispered. Margaret then reached deep into the pocket of her apron. "I have something for you as well," she said, placing a small glass jar on the table. It was one of her handmade soaps, but of a much darker color, and when he removed the lid, the rich scent of cedar and pine tar filled the room. "I know you work with your hands in the freezing cold all day," she said softly. "Commercial soaps dry your skin until it cracks. This won't do that. I made it specifically for you." The immense weight of her specific attention settled deep into Arthur's chest, carrying a significance far greater than a simple jar of soap had any right to possess. By the arrival of February, their mutual affection had grown to a point where it could no longer be contained behind polite boundaries. One evening, after a particularly challenging week where Arthur had gone out of his way to help her secure a major permanent order with the military supply officer at the distant Fort Griffin, they found themselves riding back together in the wooden wagon. The sun was setting directly behind them, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and midnight blue, and the country road was completely empty except for them. Margaret sat close beside him on the wooden bench, her shoulder brushing against his with each movement of the wagon. "Arthur," she said softly, looking out at the fading light, "you have been remarkably good to me. I want you to know that I see everything you do, and I never take it for granted." Arthur kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. "I have never thought that you did, Margaret," he replied gently. "I also want you to know," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "that I am not someone who will stay where I am not fully wanted. If you have other plans for this land come spring, you can tell me plainly, and I will find another place to go." Arthur immediately pulled the horses to a stop in the long twilight. He turned to look at her, his voice absolute quiet. "I don't want you to go anywhere, Margaret. I am not a man who is good with words, but I know that I don't want any version of my future where you are not standing right beside me. You are the most genuine person I have ever known, and I think about you every single moment of the day." Margaret looked up at him, her careful emotional control completely vanishing, leaving her expression open, warm, and wonderfully vulnerable. "I have been so afraid to say it," she whispered. "Why?" Arthur asked. "Because I didn't want to lose what we already had," she replied. Arthur reached down and took her hand. "You are never going to lose me," he said firmly. They were married in June of 1875 in the small stone church in Clearwater. It was a modest, simple ceremony attended only by their closest acquaintances, including old Silas and Harold Birch, but it was filled with an undeniable, profound truth. Margaret looked absolutely radiant in her fine green dress, carrying a small bouquet of fresh blue lupines that Arthur had ridden out to harvest at the very first light of dawn. When they returned to the estate as husband and wife, the future felt entirely limitless. The rest of that year was the most complete and satisfying period Arthur Vance had ever experienced in his 31 years of life. Every difficult task became light when shared, and every good moment became infinitely better. Margaret's business continued to expand rapidly, and she eventually hired a bright young local woman named Maria to assist her with the growing production of cheese and soap in the newly renovated dairy barn. Arthur expanded his cattle herd modestly, focusing heavily on quality, and began constructing a beautiful new addition onto the back of the main house. When Margaret gently gave birth to their firstborn son, Thomas, in January of 1876, the house that had once felt so painfully empty suddenly felt exactly the right size to contain their immense happiness. As the years passed in a beautiful blur of hard work and deep fulfillment, their family grew once again with the arrival of a beautiful, gray-eyed daughter named Jane in the summer of 1879. The estate flourished under their joint care, a perfect testament to what can be built when two resilient people combine their strength, honesty, and shared values against the hardships of life. Sitting on the wooden porch of their home on a beautiful, golden October afternoon in 1879, watching young Thomas play in the yard while baby Jane rested quietly in Margaret's arms, Arthur looked out over the eastern meadow where the goats were grazing peacefully near the clean, flowing stream. He reached over and took his wife's hand, feeling the familiar, reassuring warmth of her touch. Through all the long seasons they had shared, through the cold winters and the beautiful springs, they had learned a profound truth about existence. A truth that only truly settles into a person's soul after they have lived through enough hardship to appreciate the value of true peace. They realized that the greatest blessings in this life are almost never the ones that arrive with grand announcements or great wealth, but rather the quiet, unexpected gifts that come when we are willing to open our hearts to the stranger at our door. True strength does not lie in rigidly closing oneself off from the world to avoid pain, but in having the courage to see the inherent value and honesty in another human being and being willing to build a life together day by day, post by post, and memory by memory. Life will always bring unexpected storms, banks will reclaim land, and fortunes will fade, but a partnership built upon absolute honesty, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to the land will remain standing firm against any wind that blows. Arthur looked at his beautiful wife, then down at his children, and then out at the old black goat named Trouble, who was still standing stubbornly in the middle of the meadow, and he felt a deep, overwhelming gratitude for the wonderful day he had decided to ride down that hill and simply welcome her into his life.